Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a really close look at just two verses right at the start of the Bible, Genesis 1.1 and 1.2.
Yeah, verses most people probably think they know pretty well. They're incredibly concise.
They are. But, the source material we're using for our deep dive today, it really shows how they contain these depths, these questions that have, fascinated people for centuries.
Absolutely. They set the entire stage, don't they? Describing God's first act of creation. But then, like you said, verse 2 immediately gives us this picture that, while on the surface anyway, seems really perplexing, maybe even contradictory to that perfect creation idea.
Right, and the source we're digging into today focuses exactly on that puzzle. It's an article by Eric H. Jansen titled The Gap Theory, the war that took place between Genesis 1.1 and Genesis 1.2. Let's just read those two verses out loud, just like the article does. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters.
There you have it. Verse 1, this pure, majestic statement. God creates everything.
Simple, powerful.
But then verse 2, boom, it immediately shifts. Suddenly the earth is described as being, chaotic, empty, dark. And the big question driving the perspective we're exploring, the one Jansen's article really hammers home, is exactly that. What on earth happened between that amazing creation in verse 1 and this mess, this disorder in verse 2?
That sudden shift, that unexpected transition, that's the key, isn't it? And it's the launching point for this specific interpretation we're diving into today, the gap theory.
Right, or sometimes called the ruin restoration theory, or just restoration theory. Basically, this theory says there isn't just a smooth, immediate flow from verse 1 to verse 2. No, it suggests there's a huge hidden history packed in between them.
Hidden history?
Yeah, potentially involving something catastrophic, like a cosmic rebellion, an event that happened in the gap between the creation act of verse 1 and the chaos we see in verse 2. And that event, or maybe a whole series of events, is what caused all that disorder.
Gotcha. So our mission here, really guided by Eric Jansen's analysis in this article, is to explore this specific viewpoint, this theological perspective. We want to understand the arguments, that its supporters use, look at what it might mean for how we read other bits of the Bible, and think about the bigger cosmic picture it paints for God's work, creation, redemption, all of it. We're sticking closely to the case made in this source.
And it definitely offers, a dramatic alternative reading, doesn't it, of those opening lines. The whole idea that there might have been this massive cosmic war before the 6 days of creation we read about later in Genesis 1.
Yes, they're pretty wild.
Maybe even leaving traces we can still see out there in the cosmos. It's incredibly compelling stuff to think about.
It really is. And this deep dive, using Jansen's article as our guide, is basically meant to give you a clear, sort of structured way into this complex, sometimes controversial idea without getting totally overwhelmed. So let's unpack it.
Okay, let's start right where the source does, focusing closely on the text itself. Just those two verses, Genesis 1.1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Such a definitive statement. It's like, boom, here's the ultimate cause. The article points out this verse just firmly plants the flag. God is the sovereign creator, the origin of everything, bringing the whole universe into being by his will, his power.
Total divine authorship, immense power.
But, as the source notes, it's also really brief on the details, isn't it? Like, how did this creation happen? Or when exactly was this beginning? It doesn't really give a play-by-play.
Exactly. It's more like a foundational truth statement, not a minute-by-minute account of the first moments. It just asserts God did it. He brought the cosmos into being. Then straight away, we hit Genesis 1.2. And this is where the article highlights what feels like a sharp turn, that unexpected twist.
Right, where the earth is described.
Yeah. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters.
And this verse, this description, is really the heart of the whole gap theory question, isn't it? It seems so.
Yeah.
Different from what you might expect right after verse 1 from a perfect creator.
And the key phrase here, the one translated without form and void, the source really emphasizes getting into the original Hebrew, tohu wabohu.
Tohu wabohu. It sounds significant even just hearing it.
It does. And the article breaks down what these words mean. Tohu. It suggests emptiness, maybe formlessness, something lacking purpose or structure, unproductive, even futility.
Okay, like just nothingness.
Kind of. And then boohoo comes alongside it and just ramps it up. It intensifies that feeling of desolation, emptiness. So together, tohu wabohu, it paints this picture of utter waste, chaos, ruin, desolation, no life, no structure, just void.
And this is where the article brings in that crucial connection to Isaiah 45:80.
Yes. This verse is absolutely foundational for the gap theory reading. Isaiah 45:1, it's talking about God creating the earth, and it says explicitly using that same Hebrew word tohu in many versions. For thus says the Lord who created the heavens, who formed the earth and made it. He did not create it empty or without form, tohu. He formed it to be inhabited.
Wow. Okay. That's a really stark contrast.
Yeah.
God says he didn't create it tohu, but Genesis 1.2 describes it as tohu wabohu.
Precisely. And that's the apparent inconsistency that gap theory proponents really focus on. If God's original perfect creation in verse 1 was explicitly made, not to, designed to be lived in, then why does the very next verse describe the earth using that exact language of chaos and desolation?
It doesn't seem to fit.
According to the article, it seems inconsistent with the nature of an all-powerful God who creates perfectly. Why would his first act result immediately in chaos?
So finding tohu wabohu right there in Genesis 1.2, immediately after the creation statement in 1.1, is seen as like Exhibit A that something went seriously wrong.
That's the core argument, yeah, stemming right from looking closely at the text. The article argues that this description, chaotic, dark, desolate earth in 1.2, it doesn't show the original state, not the perfect creation from verse 1. Instead, it shows a state that happened after that initial creation, but before the 6 days of restoration that start in Genesis 1.3.
A state that resulted from something else entirely.
Right. And the other bits in verse 2, the darkness and the deep, they also add to this picture of disorder.
Yeah, what about those?
Well, according to the article, they definitely contribute. Darkness, the Hebrew is choshek. It often carries symbolic weight in the Bible, doesn't it? Usually linked to judgment, chaos, evil, maybe separation from God's light and order.
Like the plague of darkness in Egypt. The source mentions that.
Exactly, Exodus 10, that's a prime example. And the deep, or tehom, it can bring up images of those primeval, uncontrolled waters. Something wild, chaotic, needing to be subdued, which you see in some ancient creation stories. So put it all together, tohu wabohu, darkness, the deep. The picture isn't pristine creation. It looks more like a ruined state, maybe even a place under judgment.
So this clash, this apparent inconsistency between verse 1's perfection and verse 2's chaos, as the article sees it, demands some kind of explanation.
Exactly. It just doesn't seem to flow logically without one. And this inconsistency, according to the gap theory presented in the article, is what gives rise to the hypothesis. Something devastating, some event, or maybe a series of events, must have taken place in that time between the perfect creation of Genesis 1.1 and the ruined state of Genesis 1.2. Something must have happened to mess up that original order.
Which leads us right to the popular speculation the source mentions, the core of the gap theory itself.
Yes. The speculation is that this huge disruption wasn't just some natural cosmic accident. It was the outcome of a cosmic rebellion, a massive uprising against God himself, led by a powerful heavenly being and his followers.
A fallen heavenly being,
Yeah.
often identified as Satan, right?
Right. As the article lays it out, the theory proposes that this rebellion, spearheaded by the figure often called Satan or the devil, is the very thing that transformed the earth. It took it from its original, perfect, ordered state in Genesis 1.1 and turned it into the mess of tohu wabohu, darkness, and the deep that we find in Genesis 1.2.
So the chaos isn't the starting point, it's a result.
A result, yeah. Either a direct consequence of the destructive rebellion itself, or, and this is maybe more common in this interpretation, it's the result of God's swift, severe judgment on that rebellion.
Okay, so this whole idea of a cosmic rebellion is pretty central to the gap theory. How is it supported, according to the source material? Mentions biblical passages, but also other writings.
That's right. The article is upfront that, the Bible doesn't have a neat chapter titled The Pre-Adamite Rebellion. It's not laid out explicitly like that.
Okay.
However, the argument is that certain passages, when you look at them through this specific lens, they offer clues, points of connection, things that seem to support the idea.
And the main biblical support seems to come from those passages, often interpreted as describing Satan's origin and fall.
Precisely. The source points mainly to two key passages that get cited a lot in this discussion, Isaiah 14.1-15 and Ezekiel 28.9-17.
Okay, let's look at those. What does the article say about how Isaiah 14 fits in?
Well, Isaiah 14 describes this figure, often interpreted as Satan. He's called the morning star, son of dawn. That's Hillel ben Shachar in Hebrew. It got translated as Lucifer in the Latin Vulgate, and that name stuck, right?
Right, Lucifer.
The passage talks about his incredible pride. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. Above the stars of God, I will set my throne on high. I will make myself like the Most High. Just pure ambition to usurp God. And because of this, he's depicted as falling from heaven, cast down.
And Ezekiel 28, how does that one connect?
Ezekiel 28 describes a cherub, so a very high-ranking angelic being. This cherub was supposedly in Eden, the garden of God, perfect in his ways from the day he was created, until wickedness, iniquity was found in him.
The turning point.
Exactly. And because of his sin and pride, he was expelled from the mountain of God, cast out from God's presence. The description even mentions him being adorned with precious stones, emphasizing how glorious and high-ranking he originally was.
Now, the article includes a really important clarification here about these passages.
Yes, this is crucial. It points out that, on the surface, these passages seem to be talking about human rulers. The king of Babylon in Isaiah 14 and the king of Tyre in Ezekiel 28. They're set in specific historical situations.
But the gap theory interpretation sees more going on there.
Exactly. The article explains that many theologians, especially proponents of this theory, see a kind of dual meaning, a deeper layer. They argue the language used the pride, the fall from such a high place, the origins described, Eden, mountain of God being a created cherub. It seems to just go beyond what you'd say about a mere human king.
It sounds, too, cosmic.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
So the argument is the prophet is using these earthly kings as symbols, maybe parallels, but the real underlying subject is this incredibly powerful heavenly being who also rebelled against God. This dual interpretation lets them use these passages as biblical backing for the idea of Satan's original high status and his fall due to rebellion.
Okay, so within this gap theory framework, the idea is that this rebellion, this fall of a major angelic figure, wasn't just some abstract event. It had massive physical consequences for the creation mentioned back in Genesis 1.1.
That's the crucial link they make. The theory posits that this cosmic uprising, maybe even a war between God's loyal angels and this rebellious group led by the fallen angel, had a truly catastrophic impact on the initial physical creation.
And the state of tohu wabohu in Genesis 1.2 is seen as the direct result of that catastrophe.
Yes, often interpreted specifically as the result of divine judgment on the rebellion. Like God's immediate response to this cosmic betrayal was to bring the part of creation most closely associated with it, the earth, into this state of ruin, chaos, darkness. It wasn't made that way in verse 1, it became that way because of judgment.
And the article mentions that God's actions after verse 2, starting in verse 3, actually reinforce this idea of judgment, followed by restoration.
It does. Think about it. If Genesis 1.1 is the original perfect creation, and Genesis 1.2 is the ruined state after judgment, then Genesis 1.3 through 1.31 isn't describing the first creation from nothing. It's describing a restoration, a reordering of that ruined creation.
So the 6 days are about fixing, not initial making.
In this view, yes. God is bringing order back to chaos, light into darkness, separating things, making the earth habitable again. And this whole narrative of restoration, leading up to creating humans to rule over this restored earth, it supports the idea that something big and bad happened before this restoration work started.
What about the Spirit of God hovering over the waters in verse 2? How does that fit?
The article points to the Hebrew word there, ratshaf. It's not just passive floating, it suggests movement, like brooding, fluttering, maybe active care. It implies a divine active presence right there, interacting with the chaos, poised to bring change.
So not just observing the mess, but about to do something about it.
Exactly. The Spirit's movement is seen as the first step, the prelude to God's reordering work that follows. It reinforces the idea that God is actively engaging with the chaos of verse 2. He's not abandoning it in ruin. He's preparing to redeem and restore it.
Okay, this leads us to another layer of speculation within the gap theory, which the article talks about. The idea that the original creation in Genesis 1.1 might have included a whole pre-Adamite world.
Yes, this is where it gets even more speculative, maybe. The theory suggests that Genesis 1.1 might cover more than just the principle of creation. Maybe it refers to an entire era or a world that existed before Adam and Eve show up in Genesis 2. A world possibly populated by other beings entirely.
Wow. Okay, what fuels that kind of speculation, according to the source?
Well, the article points mainly to interpretations that draw on a mix of things, some biblical hints, but also texts from outside the standard Bible canon. It specifically mentions apocryphal writings, like the Book of Enoch.
Apocryphal? So these aren't books accepted as inspired scripture in most Christian traditions.
Correct. The source is very clear these are non-canonical. But take the Book of Enoch. It has these detailed stories about fallen angels, sometimes called watchers, who supposedly came down to Earth before the Great Flood.
And did what?
Corrupted humanity, corrupted animals, taught forbidden knowledge, caused all sorts of chaos. Chapter 6 and 8, for instance, describe this. Now, some gap theory proponents look at these stories, even though they're not scripture, and see them as possibly reflecting or hinting at that pre-Adamite angelic rebellion and its consequences on the physical world. It provides a narrative, a framework that fits with the idea of corruption and judgment happening before Adam.
So the idea isn't just one fallen angel, but a whole group involved in this rebellion.
Exactly. The article points to Revelation 12.4. It speaks symbolically, of course, about the dragon sweeping a third of the stars of heaven down to earth with his tail. While it's apocalyptic imagery, some gap theorists use this to suggest, look, a significant chunk of the angelic host actually sided with the rebellion.
And this large-scale rebellion, involving lots of fallen angels, would have devastated both the heavens and the physical world.
That's the connection they make. This cosmic conflict, as the theory imagines it, directly impacted the physical realm created back in Genesis 1.1. It's what turned it into the chaotic state of Genesis 1.2.
And that tohu wabohu state could then be seen as God's judgment, not just on the rebellion itself, but maybe on that whole pre-Adamite world connected to it.
Yes, the article presents that perspective. The chaos is seen as a judgment, maybe similar in scale or purpose to the later flood in Noah's time, right? Which cleansed the earth of widespread wickedness. So the pre-Adamite chaos might be God hitting reset after this cosmic betrayal and the corruption it unleashed.
You mentioned 2 Peter 3.5-6 earlier.
Right.
How does the source connect that verse to this idea of a pre-Adamite judgment involving water?
Right. This passage gets used, again, speculatively. 2 Peter 3.5-6 says something like, they deliberately overlook this fact, that the heavens existed long ago and the earth was formed out of water and through water, and that by means of these, the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished.
Okay.
The article notes that some interpreters read this as possibly talking about two separate water events. First, the earth being formed out of water and through water could connect to Genesis 1.2, right? Where you have the deep, the tehom, suggesting a watery, formless state.
Okay, like the initial chaos was watery.
Potentially. Then the part about the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished could be Noah's flood. But some interpreters wonder if Peter is actually referring to a watery judgment before the world of Noah's flood, a judgment that corresponds to the watery chaos of Genesis 1.2. So it's read by some as possible support for a pre-Adamite watery judgment.
That's definitely reading a lot into that verse. It's quite specific. Let's shift to what the article calls a speculative but fascinating addition. The idea that this cosmic war might have left actual physical traces elsewhere in our solar system.
Yeah, this is where the speculation really blasts off, you could say. The theory opens the door to thinking the impact of this huge conflict wasn't just limited to Earth's surface.
Like maybe the craters on the moon, or why Mars looks so barren.
Exactly. The article mentions those. And the extreme conditions on other planets, too. These are sometimes pointed to by gap theorists who look at them and wonder, could these be physical scars? Remnants of a universal battle that happened before humans. They see evidence of violence in the solar system impacts broken celestial bodies and speculate it might be more than just normal formation.
And there's a link made to Romans 8.22.
Yes, Romans 8.22, which says, the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. The article suggests this verse offers maybe theological room for the idea that the fallout from the rebellion and judgment wasn't just on Earth. Perhaps it introduced decay, suffering, physical disruption throughout the entire cosmos.
So the scarred planets are part of the ground.
In this highly speculative view, yeah, they could be seen as visible signs of that cosmic suffering or disruption.
Now, the article gets even more specific with an intriguing hypothesis about the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter.
Ah, yes. This one is particularly dramatic. It's a thread you find in some gap theory circles, and the article includes it. The idea is that the asteroid belt isn't just leftover junk that never quite managed to form a planet, which is the standard scientific explanation.
Right.
Instead, it's the shattered fragments of a planet that did exist. It was once whole, and then it was destroyed.
Destroyed. And this theoretical planet is sometimes linked to a specific biblical name, Rahab.
Yes, that's the name the article mentions being used in this interpretation, which immediately makes you think, because Rahab means other things in the Bible too, right?
It does. It can mean Egypt, Or, as the article points out, it's used symbolically for chaos or some kind of mythical sea monster like a dragon.
Correct. The article dives into that biblical symbolism. You find Rahab in Job 9, Job 26, Psalm 89, Isaiah 51, and in those places it often represents unruly power, chaos itself, or a mighty enemy that God defeats.
And the way God deals with Rahab in those verses sounds pretty violent.
It really does. According to the article, Rahab is described as being crushed, that's mashatz, in Job 9.13, or cut down, chatzab, in Job 26.1, or even pierced chalal in Isaiah 51.9-10. These are verbs of powerful, destructive action against something formidable.
So the speculative leap here within the gap theory is that maybe Rahab wasn't just a symbol. Maybe it refers to a literal celestial body that God actually destroyed, possibly as part of the judgment connected to that cosmic rebellion.
That's the hypothesis, yeah. Proponents suggest the destruction described isn't just metaphor, it was a real cosmic event. The article highlights Isaiah 51.9 again, where Rahab is mentioned right alongside the sea dragon. The Hebrew is Tannin. In this speculative cosmic reading, Rahab can be the name of that shattered planet. And the asteroid belt, that's the debris field, the wreckage left over from this massive, violent act of judgment.
What about the helpers of Rahab mentioned in Job 9.32? Or your enemies in Psalm 89.11? Who would they be in this scenario?
Well, within this framework, the article suggests they could be interpreted as the fallen angels who sided with the main rebel. It echoes that idea from Revelation 12.4 of a third of the stars falling. So destroying Rahab wasn't just destroying a place, maybe, but defeating the rebellious forces associated with it.
The article mentions this resonates with ancient myths about chaos monsters.
It does. It draws a parallel to figures like Leviathan in the Bible or Tiamat in Babylonian myths. You know, these ancient stories often depict a god battling some huge chaotic monster to establish order in creation. So in the Rahab asteroid belt theory, God destroying Rahab could be seen as him defeating this powerful embodiment of chaos. And that act of destruction might be what caused the resulting chaos on Earth described in Genesis 1.2.
So the destruction out there leads to the tohu wabohu here.
Potentially. The Tihom in Genesis 1.2 might even, in this view, reflect that cosmic chaos spilling over, so to speak. A state of cosmic disorder that God then has to step in and reorder, starting in verse 3.
It's an incredibly imaginative, speculative connection, linking ancient symbols to asteroids.
It really is. And the article is careful here. It injects some needed caution. It explicitly says this Rahab asteroid belt hypothesis is highly speculative. It's not directly spelled out in the Bible that God blew up a planet named Rahab.
Okay, good clarification.
It's an interpretation built on layers of symbolic reading and connecting dots. But the article presents it as a fascinating possibility within the gap theory, thinking about how a pre-Adamite rebellion and judgment might have left physical scars way beyond Earth.
And it definitely offers a different perspective from the standard scientific view of the asteroid belt.
Right. Science says failed planet formation. This theory allows proponents to look at the same asteroid fragments and see them, potentially, as evidence of a past cosmic judgment tied to a theological story. It's just a completely different interpretive lens for the same cosmic data.
Okay, let's shift slightly. The article brings up another angle, maybe a more modern one, that sometimes gets woven into these gap theory discussions. The idea that advanced technology might have been involved in the cosmic rebellion.
Yeah, this adds a layer that definitely taps into modern thinking. The idea isn't, angels in literal tin can spaceships. It's more that the way heavenly beings and their actions are described in Scripture involves powers and capabilities that, from our perspective, look like or even surpass what we'd call advanced technology.
What kind of biblical descriptions are we talking about?
Well, the article gives examples, things like the chariots of fire in 2 Kings, but the big one often cited is Ezekiel's vision in chapter 1.
The wheels within wheels.
Exactly. He describes these celestial beings, cherubim, and these incredible structures, the wheels within wheels, that move with amazing speed, complexity, coordination. Their appearance is like lightning, like burnished bronze, sparkling.
Sounds pretty high-tech in a way.
It does, doesn't it? And in this speculative view, these descriptions suggest mechanisms and powers far beyond anything humans could build back then, or maybe even now. Plus, you have apocalyptic imagery in Revelation, describing heavenly beings wielding immense power, affecting the physical world dramatically.
So the thought is, fallen angels, being powerful spiritual beings, maybe had access to knowledge or abilities that we might interpret through a technological lens today.
Pretty much. The article suggests some believers thinking along these lines propose that these fallen beings had resources, powers, knowledge, call it what you will, that could manipulate the physical universe in ways that seem advanced to us.
Yeah.
Ways far beyond our own capabilities.
And the article connects this to contemporary discussions. How so?
Well, it touches on themes you hear today, right? Discussions about the universe's origins, weird cosmological possibilities, even the whole cultural interest in potential extraterrestrial life or advanced alien civilizations. It's a theological idea that kind of bumps up against modern speculative thought.
But the article is careful to say the Bible doesn't actually mention alien technology, right?
Absolutely crucial point, yes. This is all interpretation based on descriptive language, not the Bible saying angels used warp drive. It speaks of spiritual powers, heavenly beings. This speculation tries to understand the nature of their power, especially how it might affect the physical world.
How does Ephesians 6.12 fit in? Spiritual forces in the heavenly realms.
The article mentions some interpret that phrase not just as like abstract bad vibes, but as real entities, beings with tangible power and capabilities that operate outside our normal perception, powers that could have physical effects, effects that might look technological if we could see them clearly.
So bringing this back to the chaos in Genesis 1.2, how does potential angelic technology fit the gap theory narrative?
The hypothesis here would be that the tohu wabohu, the ruined state of the earth, could be seen, maybe partly, as the physical wreckage left after the destructive use of these immense forces or capabilities by the rebellious angels. The cosmic war wasn't just spiritual, it might have involved deploying powers that literally damaged the original creation. So Genesis 1.2 shows the aftermath, perhaps combined with God's judgment layered on top.
This whole theory, with all these layers, rebellion, pre-Adamite world, cosmic traces, technology, it has a history, doesn't it? Didn't just pop up recently.
That's important context the article provides, yeah. The gap theory, as a distinct, formulated interpretation, isn't ancient, but people have been thinking about pre-Adamite states or ages for centuries.
Like the early church fathers, Origen, Augustine.
Yes, the article mentions them, but it notes that while they did speculate about Genesis 1 and maybe spiritual realms or states before humans, their discussions were often more philosophical or allegorical. They weren't usually laying out the specific literal gap judgment restoration sequence that the modern theory proposes.
So the modern version really took shape later on.
Definitely. The article points to the 19th century as key, particularly mentioning figures like Thomas Chalmers, a Scottish theologian. Chalmers was living when geology was really taking off, presenting evidence for a very, very old Earth.
Which seemed to clash with a simple reading of Genesis 1 as 6 literal 24-hour days creating everything from scratch.
Exactly. So for Chalmers and others, inserting this huge time gap and a catastrophe between Genesis 1.1 and 1.2 was a way to reconcile things. It let them hold on to God's initial creation in verse 1 and the six-day restoration starting in verse 3, while also making room for the geological discoveries suggesting a much older Earth with lots of pre-human history visible in rocks and fossils.
So the fossils could belong to that first creation destroyed in the gap.
That was the idea. The fossils weren't from Noah's flood necessarily, but from life in that original Genesis 1.1 creation, which was wiped out during the gap judgment.
And then there was a specific publication that really boosted the theory's popularity.
Yes, the Scofield Reference Bible. Huge impact. First published in 1917. This study Bible had notes right in the margins, and those notes explicitly supported the gap theory reading of Genesis 1.1 to 2. It said, verse 2 described a ruined creation after a judgment.
And that Bible became really popular.
Enormously influential, especially in American evangelical circles. Its widespread use really popularized the gap theory, making it a common, almost standard view for many people for a long time.
So where does the theory stand today, according to the source? Is it still widely held?
The article says it remains pretty controversial in biblical scholarship and theology. It's definitely not the main view taught in most seminaries today. Many scholars offer different ways to interpret Genesis 1.1 to 2 that don't need a gap at all.
But it hasn't disappeared.
No, it persists. Especially, the article suggests, among people who are looking for a framework that helps them integrate their belief in the Bible's authority with scientific findings that point to a really ancient universe and Earth.
And the argument often comes back to geology and fossils, right?
Yes. According to the article, a key point for proponents is that the gap theory offers a way to explain things like vast geological timescales, layers of rock strata, the fossil record things that look older than human history, without having to say the 6 days in Genesis 1.3 and following weren't literal days, or without attributing everything in the fossil record just to Noah's flood. The pre-Adamic fossils belong to the gap. It provides a structure to fit both biblical accounts as they interpret them and scientific observations together. Now, let's pivot to the theological implications. If someone accepts this gap theory hypothesis as laid out by Jansen, what does it mean for their broader understanding of God, evil, humanity?
It has significant implications across the board, and Jansen outlines several key areas. First, God's sovereignty.
How does it impact that? You'd think a massive rebellion might challenge God's control.
You might think so, but Jansen argues the narrative actually reinforces it. Yes, the theory posits a rebellion, but look what happens immediately after the chaos in 1.2. God doesn't retreat. He steps in actively, powerfully, bringing order from the disorder over the next 6 days. The article stresses this demonstrates God's ultimate authority. He remains sovereign even over rebellion and chaos. The spirit hovering, Ralchaf, is a symbol of his persistent restorative power at work.
So the chaos doesn't diminish God. His response to it magnifies his power.
That's the perspective Jansen presents. Second major implication, the origin of evil.
Where does it place the start of evil?
Crucially, before Adam and Eve's sin in Genesis 3, the gap theory, as Jansen explains, suggests evil didn't begin with humanity. Its ultimate roots lie in that earlier cosmic rebellion of a heavenly being, Satan Lucifer, against God. This provides for proponents a deeper understanding of the spiritual battle woven throughout the entire Bible. It's not just a human problem. It has prior cosmic origins.
So the serpent in the garden isn't the beginning of the story of evil, but a continuation of an older conflict.
Exactly. That's the framework Jansen describes. Third, it impacts the view of the human calling.
How does our purpose change in this view?
Well, if the earth was already in a state of chaos due to a prior conflict when humanity was created during the restoration phase, then our mandate in Genesis 1.28 to fill the earth and subdue it takes on a richer meaning. Jansen points out it suggests we're created not just to steward a perfect world, but potentially to participate in God's ongoing work of restoring order, righteousness, and justice to a creation already impacted by evil and chaos. Being made in God's image involves reflecting his restorative nature in a fallen environment.
That's a profound shift, and not just caretakers of paradise, but active agents in restoration from the very beginning.
It adds that dimension, yes. Fourth, Jansen connects it to eschatological hope, the Bible's teachings about the end times.
How does a theory about Genesis 1 relate to Revelation?
Jansen argues the proposed rebellion in the gap foreshadows and connects directly to the final conflicts described in Revelation, particularly chapters 12 and 20, which depict the ultimate defeat of Satan, the dragon, and his forces. By linking the beginning, Genesis 1, with the end, Revelation, the gap theory frames the entire biblical narrative as one grand story of conflict, redemption, and God's ultimate triumph over the forces that caused that initial chaos. The chaos of 1.2 isn't the final word. It's a temporary disruption God overcomes, leading to the final new heavens and new earth.
It ties the whole story together, beginning to end, under this banner of cosmic conflict and restoration.
That's the idea. And finally, Jansen suggests it broadens the scope of creation. If Genesis 1.1 refers to an original creation, possibly far vaster than just Earth, maybe including realms affected by the rebellion, then the theory opens the door to thinking about God's plan on a truly cosmic scale, beyond just human history on this planet. Jansen suggests this can inspire awe at the sheer magnitude of God's creative work and redemptive purposes, perhaps extending even beyond our current understanding of the universe.
It definitely makes you contemplate the vastness implied in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. What all did that encompass?
Precisely. It invites that kind of expansive thinking.
Okay. We've covered a lot of ground here, taking this deep dive into the gap theory based entirely on Eric H. Jansen's article. It's definitely an intricate interpretation.
It really is. Let's pause for a moment just for some critical reflection, drawing on the article's wrap-up thoughts.
Right. So to boil it down again, the core idea presented in this source. The gap theory interprets Genesis 1.1 to 2 by proposing a significant time gap between them. And in that gap, a cosmic conflict led by a fallen angel resulted in the chaos we read about in verse 2.
And it tries to weave together certain Bible verses, some ideas from apocryphal texts, theological reasoning.
Yeah, to build this narrative of a pre-Adamite rebellion and judgment, seeing humanity's creation as key to God's plan to restore that damaged creation.
And as the article makes very clear, this is not a universally accepted theory among scholars or theologians today.
No, definitely not. It has its critics, faces challenges based on Hebrew grammar, context, other theological points. But the article presents it as a framework that its proponents find useful, even compelling, for tackling some really tough questions.
Like the age of the earth, the origin of evil on a cosmic scale, the potential scope of spiritual warfare.
Exactly. For some, it offers a way to try and harmonize their reading of Scripture with scientific observations about the universe's age or the fossil record without giving up on other core beliefs.
The article also offers a final thought for people reflecting on all this from a faith perspective.
It does. It basically suggests that whether you end up agreeing with the gap theory or not, just wrestling with these ideas, the possibility of such a vast creation, the stark reality of spiritual conflict, the devastating consequences of rebellion, and especially God's incredible power to restore, can actually deepen your understanding of some really profound things.
It can increase your sense of awe at God's majesty.
Yeah, exactly. It really underscores the mystery packed into those first two verses, doesn't it?
It does.
As Eric Jansen's article concludes, Genesis 1.1 to 2, regardless of how exactly you interpret the relationship between them, remains this powerful invitation, an invitation to just marvel at God's sheer majesty. He's the creator. He's the one who turns chaos into order, who brings light out of the deepest darkness.
Okay, so let's quickly recap this deep dive. We've used Eric H. Jansen's article on the gap theory as our primary source to explore the specific interpretation of Genesis 1.1 to 2. We looked into the meaning of tohu wabohu, that crucial phrase, and the contrast it creates. We saw how the theory links this chaos to biblical passages about a fallen angel, like Lucifer or the cherub in Ezekiel.
We touched on the idea of a pre-Adamite world, possibly drawing on non-canonical texts like Enoch for narrative color.
Right, and then the really speculative stuff, the potential cosmic traces like the Rahab asteroid belt idea, and even the suggestion of advanced technology being involved in the rebellion.
We also trace its history, from early thoughts to Chalmers trying to reconcile geology, and the big boost from the Schofield Reference Bible.
And finally, we examine those significant theological implications. What it means for God's sovereignty, the origin of evil before humans, humanity's calling maybe being about restoration, how it connects to end times hope, and the vast scope of creation it suggests.
And just to reiterate, our goal here was really to process the arguments and ideas presented in that specific source material by Jansen, to give you a clear picture of this particular perspective and the reasoning behind it.
It is definitely a lot to think about. The source article finishes by saying that, accept the gap theory or not, Genesis 1.1 to 2 invites us to marvel at God who transforms chaos into order, and it inspires us to take our own calling as stewards seriously, looking forward to when all things are made new. So here's a final thought for you to take away, inspired by that conclusion from the source. How does thinking about God actively engaging with and transforming a pre-existing chaos, rather than just creating pristine perfection from absolute nothingness right at the start? How might that change how you see your own role? Your role in bringing order, purpose, or restoration to the messy, chaotic situations in your own life, your community, maybe even the wider world.
That definitely brings the ancient text right into today, doesn't it? A challenging thought.
Indeed. That's all for this deep dive.